All right. I'll start my introductions here. So welcome everyone. Welcome to the first taste of summer. It has gotten to the mid 80s this week, but this is Minnesota, so you never know. It could be snowing next week. You know it's going to be a fun day when you're heating in the morning and cooling in the afternoon. Anyway, I'm Damon Monty with Accessible Services at the IDS Center. I'm the current president of the Engineers Association. I have a couple of announcements. Reminder that if you're interested in achieving your SMA or SMT certification or designation, BOMI is now offering online self-paced courses. You can visit their website for more information. So registration is open for the annual meeting held virtually on April 15th with Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey. He will provide an update report on the Chauvin trial, discuss public safety in general, and detail efforts by the city in partnerships with business community, that's including BOMA, helping with the rebound of Minneapolis's business environment. We'll also be holding our annual election of officers during this meeting. And just a reminder, all engineers are welcome to attend both engineer and general meetings. So our next engineer meeting will be held virtually on May 5th. We're still working on confirming the meeting topic, and we'll be updating you on with our weekly communications. So now I'm going to introduce today's speakers, Brian Brahms, System Sales, and Mark Snodgrass, System Design Manager, and they're with LVC companies. Brian has been with LVC since 2001 and currently works with System Sales for its fire alarm division. He works with stakeholders in new construction, retrofits, expansions, and remodels. Brian combines his manufacturing knowledge, familiarity with fire codes, and business acumen to ensure that projects are perfectly understood and flawlessly executed. Mark is a 19-year veteran in the low voltage industry, and he's doing design work for fire systems. He does intrusion alarm systems, video surveillance systems, access control systems. He has extensive working knowledge of building, fire, mechanical, and electrical code. Makes him a great team player and contributing to the customer's needs. While they're presenting, if anybody has any questions, feel free to use the Q&A or chat functions below. I just want to say thank you very much, guys, for taking the time to present to the Engineers Association today. And with that, I'm just going to let you take it from here.
Thanks, Damon. I'd like to thank Mark for joining me and for BOMA for setting this up, and some of the colleagues who wrote that flattering introduction to us. We're happy to talk about the still kind of new 2020 fire alarm code. I'm going to share my screen. Do we have that up? There we go. Can everyone see? So here's me. That's what I looked like 10 years ago.
Brian, this is Riley. It looks like we're viewing your Zoom internet window.
Okay, let's try that again. How did that happen?
I always say it always works in practice, so
Yeah, no
you're
doubt.
good. No worries here.
Slideshow from the beginning. We have that.
Okay. Yep. We see your slides now, not in full screen.
There we go.
Yep. Good to go.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your patience. So this is me. I've worked for LVC for almost 20 years. At the end of Memorial Day, or after Memorial Day, will be 20 years. I was a service rep for LVC. I've worked with a lot of BOMA clients in downtown Minneapolis and other locations. For the last 8 years, I've been in our install division, and we're here to talk about the 2020 fire alarm code. Mark, you want to just say anything before we begin?
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. Mark Snodgrass, LVC. I'm the design manager. So I've been with LVC for 6 years and in the industry for 19, 20 years, I guess. I don't keep count anymore. But anyways, primarily my background is strong in fire alarm, and now I do everything low voltage, so which is pretty awesome because it's pretty fun stuff, exciting stuff. And I've done this work in all 50 states, so I see how it is in Minnesota. I know what it's like in other parts of the country. And Minnesota is my favorite place to do it, not because, well, man, I'm biased because I live here, but also it's just a great place to be in this field. So thanks again for having us. And we're going to try to make this interesting. I'm talking about code for a whole hour. Does not sound fun, but we're not going to cover every code change that came out. We're going to cover code changes that are relevant to building owners, building engineers, management companies, you know, the stuff that's of interest to you. So we hope that you find the presentation helpful and interesting to you as well.
Thanks, Mark. So here is a picture of what the fire codes look like if you order the hard copy. They gave a shout out to Duluth on the photos. We're going to be talking about the 2020 fire alarm code, which became effective in the state of Minnesota on the 31st of March, 2020. For new construction, this would apply to buildings whose building permits were pulled after that date. There's not a lot of retroactivity in the 2020 fire alarm codes. If there is, it would have to do with any construction in a facility that's level 2, 3, or 4, you know, kind of a full gut or more than 50%. Don't want to get into that too much. The Minnesota State Fire Code is based off of the 2018 International Code Council's fire codes, or the ICC. Many years ago, there were a lot of competing codes. In the late 90s, they kind of rolled up into the ICC. By the year 2000, most of the codes were published. Those are the model codes. Those codes are amended by the state of Minnesota, the Department of Labor and Industry, Council of Fire Marshals and other qualified personnel provide direction to the Department of Labor and Industry, and the state legislature adopts those into the force of law. So they are amended. Some sections are deleted, added, edited. So the Minnesota State Fire Code is, in general, what is enforceable in the state of Minnesota. The fire code tells people who manage buildings, who design fire alarm systems, designers, installers, architects, engineers. This tells us what to do in a given situation. The fire code is the code. It has the force of legal weight. We're also going to get into, and there's that building code. You'll notice too that the building codes and the fire codes are both ICC documents as amended by the state of Minnesota. Most of the fire codes and building codes correspond. With the 2008 adoption of the model codes as amended by the state of Minnesota in 2020, it now refers everyone to NFPA 72 2016 edition. NFPA 72 is a standard. It's not really a code. The code tells you where manual pull stations are required. NFPA 72 tells installers how to install them, 48 inches, 40 inches off the ground, etc. So the code is what really answers when, where, why. NFPA 72 says how things are done, when it's required, or when it's part of a performance-based design. But a big change with the Minnesota State Fire Code is that we went from the 2010 edition to NFPA 72 to the 2016 edition. Mark, do you want to say anything about the three codes we just glossed over?
No, I think you did it pretty well. I mean, it's funny because the slide you see on the screen right now says National Fire Alarm Signaling Code, but 72, like Brian said, is a standard. So it's like the model code tells you what you need, and the standard tells you how to put it in. And a lot of the changes we're talking about today come from this green document that you're looking at right now, NFPA 72.
And I know that a lot of you manage existing buildings. So if you really want to know how this affects you, Chapter 14 governs all the inspection requirements. And for your reference, you can access those at any point, or give your fire alarm contractor a call with any help. Just another piece of housekeeping. There's a bunch of different occupancies. I'm not sure. I think most of you are high rise or business occupant or manage those kinds of buildings, but there's a number of different occupancies. Just really quick, there's group A occupancies, which are theaters, dining rooms, auditoriums, stadiums. Business occupancies are the places where business is conducted and commerce. Educational opportunities, K-12, are public education, private parochial schools. Colleges and universities are actually B occupancies because there's no kids in there, there's adults. So E occupancies are K-12 schools. Factories and industry applications, hangars, storage, etc. I'm sorry, factories and industrials where it's a pretty unique application, a lot of performance-based design, not much prescriptive. You can have high hazard applications in there. Institutional applications are all of the I occupancies. I1 is for supervised custodial care. I2s are for hospitals, nursing homes, detox centers, supervised living, etc. There's also I3, which are jails, prisons, and detention centers, and I4, which are adult daycare services or child daycare services for kids that are less than kindergarten age. There's a mercantile occupancy that is not recognized in the state of Minnesota. It generally falls into the B or A occupancy classification. Residential, there's a number of different residentials. There's R1s, which are hotels, motels, boarding homes, those kinds of places. R2s are your apartment buildings, dormitories, other congregational living situations. There's R3, which are 1 or 2 family homes, lodging homes, some smaller family daycares. And then R4 is more of a supervised residency, treatment facility, supervised living, etc. And then again, there's some storage occupancies, which are your parking ramps and other storage, high rack storage applications, and some miscellaneous types as well. Mark, you want to expand on anything regarding occupancy classification?
No, I think you covered it very well. And if you ever have a question about what occupancy you're dealing with or what, sometimes buildings have multiple occupancies, certainly reach out to us. We'll be glad to help you out with that.
And just a further note on occupancies, they can be amended. There's occupancy load can govern a lot of code considerations, how many people are in the building. There can be occupancy load questions about how many people are subgrade below the ground, whether it's a high rise or not, how many people are above the lowest level of egress discharge. So a lot of factors weigh into code decisions based on occupancy types. With that, we'll get into the code changes. What we're really going to do, there's like I said, there's a lot in the code. We're going to go through the Minnesota State Fire Code first and just call out the changes because I know that you're all experts on the code, right? So you just want to know what's new. I will caution everyone to understand that just because you read one section of the code, it doesn't mean that that's the end all and be all. There are other sections in other chapters that can affect the understanding and interpretation of the codes. So, be careful when you're looking at just one sentence. And then another caveat on fire codes or standards is that there's a lot left to interpretations. There can be insurance risk analysts involved. There can be obviously fire marshals, city fire code officials, building officials, mechanical inspectors, fire inspectors, elevator inspectors, and they all weigh in on how code is interpreted. We always try as fire alarm contractors to put a good faith interpretation out there, but we are not the judge, we are not the jury. So I just want to make sure everyone understands that. We're not going to read the codes verbatim. So we've listed the code in this presentation, which will be made available after this to BOMA folks. We have added some red text that kind of highlight the common sense behind the code. And with that, Mark, I will leave it to you. You are a resident scholar in your library at LBC. So if you want to expand on certain sections of the code, I will comment as needed and move the presentation along. You want to take it away?
Yeah, thanks. So basically the black and white text is the actual code language, and the red text is kind of LVC's commentary. Like Brian said, I'm not going to read it word for word because I'd bore the heck out of you. So Brian and I are going to kind of informal, go back and forth a little bit just so you don't have to listen to me ramble on the whole time. But the very section you see in front of you, it's a new section. It's pretty cool. I like it because it gives some leverage, some protection to those building owners for that situation where you have a whole bunch of fire alarm devices in your building that are not required by today's code. Can you take them out? What do? Do you have to leave them forever? We have run into situations where the authority having jurisdiction says you can never diminish the level of fire protection. So even though those smoke detectors that are all over the place in a sprinkled building may not be required, can you get rid of them because the current code doesn't require them? They were put in however many years ago for whatever reason. Maybe it was the code required them at that time, or maybe the owner voluntarily wanted them, or their insurance company wanted extra devices. I use the example of smoke detectors because oftentimes they're not required in a sprinkled building, but certain occupancies they can be, so it kind of depends. But this section basically gives you leverage that you're not required to maintain those devices that are above and beyond today's code. That doesn't just mean go and start ripping stuff out. Definitely want to get the authority having jurisdiction to approve that, to buy in on it. But if the authority having jurisdiction is reluctant, we definitely have some code language, the one that you're looking at right in front of you on the screen, that protects contractor and owner if they should want to remove those non-required devices. So I'll go to the next one.
Yeah, and I'll just comment a little bit on that. That's manual pull stations, for example, are something that it's really not required in a lot of code beyond hospitals and other high occupancies. Nevertheless, if you have an old building that has a bunch of manual pull stations, you can certainly take them out. You also want to be mindful of your tenants. A lot of B occupancies that don't have horn strobes. It gets a little difficult to manage a building when you have horn strobes for the folks on one side of the hall, but on the other side of the hall, when you do your fire drill, or if there's an actual fire, that inconsistency in design can lead to some confusion. So there's always a discussion that you want to have with your contractor and obviously with the city fire code official. So be mindful of that. Okay, next slide.
So group E occupancies, that's educational, that's K through 12. This is just a pretty simple section that now a voice is required in schools. So you can't have a horn for occupant notification. You have to have pre-recorded emergency voice message. A lot of schools have been doing this voluntarily for the last 10 years or so, but now it's required in the code, and Minnesota is kind of catching up to the way the rest of the country does it, because outside of Minnesota, a lot of states have already been doing this. So pretty self-explanatory there.
Yeah, and thanks, Mark. I think this is one of the really good improvements in the schools. Most kids in schools aren't hurt by fire, they're hurt by violence of one form or another. So the ability to have voice communication in our public schools, I think is a vast improvement. And like Mark said, it's been part of the model code for years, but this is the first time that Minnesota has now adopted and enforced it in E-occupancies.
So here's a section that's regards to how loud the fire alarm system has to be. There's a minimum we have to meet, and that's 15 decibels over the ambient noise level. But now the code's putting a maximum. You can only be loud to a certain extent. I think it says 35 decibels. So just be aware there could be those situations where maybe instead of going into your building and adding more audible devices to make it louder, if you have areas in your building that are already too loud, they're over 35 dB above the ambient noise level, it could become an issue to the point where we might want to remove some audible devices. I don't think you would see that often, but there could be some areas where, like right now, I'm in a small conference room. If you're to put, a few horns in this room, we might meet that 35 dB level. Not that you would have a few horns in a small room, but just be aware of that. There could be some applications where that could come into play.
And this is part of the code too that drives applications where you have your speaker strobes or your horn strobes out in the corridor, but you only have a strobe in the toilet rooms or the conference rooms because that noise is going to come through the door too. So this is an interesting new part of the code. There's a visual signaling and audio signaling in most applications.
Alrighty, group R2, so that's apartments and townhomes, basically. This is just a clarification, is that we have certain rooms or certain dwelling units, you might call them ADA units or accessible units, where we're not doing just audible signaling, but we're also doing visual signaling for the hearing impaired. And there was some language previously in the code that says we have to have the capability to support strobes in the future, should someone move into that apartment who has hearing impairment. And the big question was, what does capability mean? And some people take that to the full extent that we have to actually rough in back boxes in the wall for strobes in the future, and apartments are usually all, you know, if it's a sheetrock ceiling, whatever, you don't have access, so you got to run conduit out to an accessible location. That's like accessible to the extreme, but this is just language that was clarified, and it does help protect the owner, I believe, in an apartment owner situation where future capability really is a little bit looser. I mean, we have the capability to tear the whole building down and rebuild if we had to. I mean, it's ridiculous, but capability does extend beyond you know, what I just described. It doesn't have to be fully roughed in, ready to go for future strobes. So it's a good section because it does help protect the owner as well.
And then I just want to give a bonus tip for all of you that manage buildings. You know, when do you need visual signaling? When do you need audio signaling? The common sense behind the code is if I get a job and I'm with some office in the IDS center and I can't hear just because of how I was born, you know, I'm going to let the HR person know. HR is going to contact Damon, right? Damon's going to put a strobe in my private office because I wouldn't be able to hear the speaker strobes out in the corridor in the general area. But if I go to use the bathroom, a conference room, a wellness room, mothers and nursing rooms, etc., you need to make sure that that person who can't hear when they're in common areas, that they have a way to understand that the fire alarm's going off because of the visual signaling. So that's just kind of a bonus tip behind some of the fire codes.
Here's a new requirement for Group E occupancies, going back to Group E now, and that is again K through 12. And so this slide plus the next two that follow this one, so 3 in a row, basically are all kind of the same, based on the same code requirement, and that is CO, carbon monoxide detection, is now required in schools. There's some exceptions to that, but generally, if you have any fuel burning appliances, generally your heat's going to be, you know, if it's a rooftop air handler that's gas fed, you have a fuel burning appliance. So you're required to have CO detection in your classrooms now in schools. That's a new requirement, and even over the last year since this requirement came about, I've seen this get missed a few times, and it's a big one to miss because you don't want to come in at the final hour of the job and have to put in CO detection in all your classrooms. Now, there's some exceptions to that, such that if you have a duct branch that serves multiple classrooms, you only need CO detection in the first classroom, but not the ones that are downstream. So then you have to look at your mechanical layout and see where your ductwork is going. But if you're involved in schools in any way, shape, and form, you definitely want to be aware of this new requirement for CO detection in the school occupancies.
Thanks, Mark. And again, just in terms of the changes in the fire code, carbon monoxide poisoning is becoming more and more people are paying attention to it. There can be mechanical systems that test carbon monoxide. The fire alarm is also a great way to test for that. And anybody listening who works in a hotel environment or other R occupancies, there's a lot of attention paid to CO detection. Oh, next slide. Mark?
Yeah, go 2 more. There we go.
Yep.
1 more. All right. Here's a new requirement. It's actually kind of cool. So now we're into the NFPA 72 changes, which is most of the fire code changes. So again, that's the standard that tells you how to basically put in your system and maintain it and deal with your system once your devices are in place. And this is a pretty cool section that actually is really great for owners because it's that situation where you hire a fire alarm contractor, they take care of you, they change all the passwords on the panel so only they can program it, and then they don't want to play nice or whatever, and they don't want to hand over that password when it's time if you decide you want to go to a different vendor. And this gets to be a real sticky situation, and sometimes the authority having jurisdiction has to get involved and go knock on the door of that fire alarm contractor to say, hey, you got to cough up those passwords. Well, this is language actually that says the fire alarm contractor is responsible for providing those passwords or instructions on how to obtain those passwords. So if you're having trouble with the fire alarm contractor, not playing nice, you have some leverage, and it is in the code, which is a legal, I should say legal binding document, but it is adopted by the state, so it becomes a legal thing. So, and then you can get the fire marshal involved too if you have to. So pretty self-explanatory, but I think it's a good section for building owners.
And this is a nice addition to the code, in my opinion. Fire alarm contractors compete for your business because of our knowledge, our expertise, our service, the value that we provide. And in my opinion, it's always been my opinion that the passwords should be the owner's proprietary information. Now the code enforces this perspective. So if you need it, you should be able to get it. And here's the code section that tells folks why.
Here's a new section regarding a document box that's required at basically at the fire alarm panel. Not a big deal, and it's not retroactive. It's not for every building that's currently in existence. It's more for buildings new going forward, but it's pretty cool. Also for the building owner, this is a good thing because that documentation, that paperwork for the most recent inspection of that fire alarm system, which can be a very important piece of paper. What do we do if that gets lost, or where do we store it? Is it in somebody's office, whatever? Well, a little easier to find if it's in a big red box that's called, documents, and it's sitting right next to the fire alarm panel. So that's great for contractors, great for owners. I think everybody wins on that one. And it's really not that expensive of a box. If you look at the cost of the system, what's an extra $100 or whatever. So pretty self-explanatory there.
And this is required in new applications. There's nothing stopping you from ordering a document box with someone's logo on it, a jump drive. If you want to avoid the curled up yellow papers behind the electrical conduit coming down into the panel, this is the way to do it. But it's actually required per code for new installations.
Here's a new section regarding the silencing of your fire alarm system. So there's a button on your fire alarm system that says silence, and that has traditionally cut the audibles out. So whether it's a horn or a pre-recorded voice message, that gets cut out, the strobes remain active. That's the way it's been for such a long time. This is a new section that says that if you silence the system, you have to kill both the audible and the visual, because otherwise you're telling the hearing impaired one thing and the visually impaired something else. You're telling one group that there's still an alarm, and you're telling another group that it's all clear. So this has to be fair for everybody. So if we're going to kill one or the other, we have to kill them both. And sometimes this becomes an issue on existing systems where the authority having jurisdiction still wants it that way. And it can be a little bit costly to have it behave this way, depending upon how things are wired. If you want to kill the horns, keep the strobes, that kind of thing. But if the authority having jurisdiction is requiring that, it's a little bit of leverage to say, well, no, we're in compliance. If we're killing the horns and the strobes, we're in compliance because of this code section that you see right here in front of you.
Yeah, and if anyone is managing occupancies, I2s, hospitals, there are some options that you have too. Neonatal NICU kind of environments, you may not need, you might be able to do something differently in private signaling, chime strobes, but for most of your applications, it's either all or nothing unless some other arrangement's been arrived at with the local fire marshal and in writing.
Okay, let's go to the next one, Brian.
Yep, that's pretty.
Okay. This one pretty self-explanatory. It's not a new section, but it does show up now in the fire code when previously it was just in the electrical code. And that has to do with surge protection for any circuits that leave the building. Oftentimes we'll have low voltage devices that are outside the building, or maybe you're going from building to building. This just clarifies that we need to have surge protection. So if it's an existing building application, you might not have that currently just because however long ago that was installed, or maybe the surge protector, even if it was installed recently, maybe it was just missed. So that's something that we would want to address as a fire alarm contractor to make sure we don't have transient surges that come into your building. And it doesn't have to be a direct lightning strike on that cable that goes outside to monitor that outside PIV fire valve outside. It could be, those transient lightning strikes can travel through the ground for, I don't know, quite a large distance. So, we want to prevent that stuff from coming into your building. So surge protectors are there for a reason, and the code does now address that. So it's a good thing to be aware of.
Yeah, and Mark, just my experience, it's those PIV valves. If you have a lot of post indicator valves, those things outside or by the parking lot where you can shut off manually all of the water into your building, the fire alarm system needs to monitor that. And if they're ever hit by lightning, they can travel down a pretty long length of cervix of conduit and fry everything attached to that. So if anyone has buildings with PIV valves, I would ask your fire alarm contractor to check and see if you have these installed, and if not, you might want to think about doing that, just risk mitigation. I'll say something about this one. This is a recall program, so it is in the fire code that the owners need to be contacted if there's any kind of recall. I know that there was a great big sprinkler recall, maybe 20 years in the industry that just lasted another 20 years to get rid of, but this is now introducing by force of law the requirement that the owners need to be notified by vendors that any system needs to be recalled. And this will affect a lot of our listeners. Back before, the owner was ultimately responsible for issues regarding the fire alarm, whether it wasn't inspected, whether repairs weren't being conducted. This is a new code section that officially allows property owners to transfer the responsibility for maintaining and inspecting the fire alarm system to a management entity, to a single tenant, maybe via the lease. But this is a section of the code that is new, and it does affect, I imagine, a lot of our BOMA listeners. Mark, you want to have anything to say on those two?
Yeah, this is a great section because previously the code, depends on how you interpret it, the owner could not pass along the responsibility for having inspections to their tenant. Maybe their tenant occupies the entire building and they're a great tenant and they have an insurance company and they want to do everything right anyways. The owner can't technically pass that along to the tenant, but now they can. There's some language in there because I think frankly that happens anyway sometimes just because of circumstances of life, is that that situation I just described may happen. So now the code supports you in that, so it's good going forward. It's great for owners.
This is another thing that affects a lot of our BOMA clients. You should have a test plan to make sure that your critical fire and life safety system that's tied to HVAC and security and elevators and sprinkler systems and carbon monoxide detection, you need to make sure that that's inspected per Chapter 14 of NFPA 72 2016 edition. So this is part of the code that actually calls out that a test plan and results shall be documented. If you've got a good fire alarm contractor, you might not need to look any farther than part of the proposed service plan and that you're buying from your contractor. This does explicitly require testing and results to be recorded on site. Mark, anything?
Yeah, if you have a building with unique circumstances or I guess any special application, we've seen before, sometimes it's hard to get in and test devices because you have a 24/7 operation for this factory assembly line or whatever it is. And so in your test plan, that would be a good place to say, hey, we can only test this part of the system on Christmas Day because that's when they shut the line down or something like that. I mean, no one would want to do that, but I mean, sometimes we end up in those situations. And or if the authority having jurisdiction gave you permission to test those maybe every other year instead of every year or something goofy like that, well, test plan would be a good place to document that because it protects everybody if it's documented. So pretty good stuff.
And I think this applies, I know a lot of you have some pretty high atriums, right? So if you've got devices in the atrium, they really need to be tested every year. You may need to get an expensive lift to get up there and test them. So that's a common issue. Also, we've seen a lot of facilities that are built on old data centers, right? So you actually have to move desks and there's no sprinkler system in the old subfloor. So those kinds of things need to be addressed to come into compliance with this section of the code. Now here's one, Mark, I'll let you talk, but I just want to clarify. There's two different kinds of detectors out there for smoke. There are single station smoke alarms. These are your 120 hardwired systems. You see a lot of them in apartment buildings or our occupancies. They're standalone. They don't report to the fire alarm system. They won't roll the fire trucks. They don't activate the horn strobes out in the corridor. Those are single station smoke alarms. What LVC works a lot with are smoke detectors. These are powered by the fire alarm control system. They're monitored by the fire alarm control panel. They enunciate if they go into alarm at a central station, they will roll fire trucks. But this portion of the code just deals with single station smoke alarms that are independent of the fire alarm system.
Yeah, well said. So pretty much this section here is owner specific because smoke alarms are generally not touched by the fire alarm contractor. So there is some language here. It's pretty brief and short and self-explanatory, but it tells you how often those have to be tested. I have smoke alarms in my house, and I'm pretty sure I don't hit the test button every month. So you can kind of take that how you will. But if you're looking for the requirements, there it is right there in black and white.
And this is new. I just kind of want to segue a little bit into a different part of the code. The fire code is starting to acknowledge the fact that first responders, and this really was, there was a lot of study about 9/11 and all of the tragic loss of life there. One of the issues that first responders had is that their radios didn't work when they were in parts of the building. There's a new requirement in a lot of cities, Bloomington, Edina, Plymouth, and increasingly more, where you have to have 800 megahertz repeaters in buildings. And it is enforceable in some municipalities. It is not enforceable in Minneapolis, but it's getting a lot of attention in the fire and life safety industry. And in some cities like Boston, it is required in every building. An in-building emergency radio communication system can be called an emergency radio repeater, distributed bidirectional amplification system. The purpose of these devices is to identify areas in buildings, especially if there maybe there's a 5-story parking ramp between you and the 800 megahertz repeater or antenna that the first responders use, police, fire, etc. Maybe in the subfloors, the signal strength isn't that good. I personally know fire responders who've been called after hours to get someone out of an elevator, and their radios don't work in that part of the building. Increasingly, and I think in the future, you will see systems being installed. A lot of fire alarm contractors like LVC are putting these in. The fire alarm system can monitor them for power, etc. But stay tuned on this. I do expect to see more attention paid to whether or not the cops and the fire guys' radios work in every part of a building. So that's what this in-building radio communication system is. Mark?
Yeah, the reason I put it in the slide here is mainly to bring attention to it as you've addressed, because this is something that starting to gain some traction because of, the fire departments realize they have an issue sometimes. Fire and police, this isn't just fire, they have issues communicating in certain buildings, and that can be a problem, obviously, especially if somebody is in danger or in need of additional assistance. So this is something that I think you're gonna start to see more and more of, just to be aware of it. So.
And just for any code geeks out there, if you look at the model codes, this is actually required in the 2018 International Fire Code. Minnesota has removed that from the requirements in the code. It's now, is it Appendix L, Mark? I think it's in the appendix of the Minnesota State Fire Code. And what a lot of local municipalities have, not a lot, but a handful, and like I said, I think there'll be more. What they've done is they've taken this appendix, sometimes verbatim, put it in front of the city council, the mayor adopts it, and now it does become a requirement in that city. In Bloomington, if you know Bloomington, on the east side, there's not a lot of hills. The radios work well. On the west side, there's a lot of hills, and there's even some 3-level apartment buildings where a firefighter, her radio doesn't work in the basement, so they might have to put in one of these repeaters. But it's just something to pay attention to, and I think you'll see more attention given to this from localities in the future. Voice intelligibility. Mark, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so this is a new section, and I'll just be real brief on this one. Is intelligibility is the clarity of the voice message. Can you understand it? And so there's been some stuff in the code about you need to use some expensive meter, which is like a $10,000 meter. It's ridiculous. But the code's saying you don't need to do a quantitative measure. That would be the meter. A qualitative approach, which is the common sense approach, is recognized, which I like because it just makes sense. You have someone get on the live mic and say certain words and have different people disperse in different parts of that building. And if those people can repeat back all the words that the person on the live mic said, then I'd say you've qualified that it is intelligible. Obviously, they understood it if they can repeat it back. So this is great for everybody because we don't have to go out and find an expensive meter to have an official reading of what the intelligibility is. We can go on to the next one. So this is a section that's specific to the owner. Wait, I'm the wrong one.
Permit records?
Yep. Okay. So your fire alarm contractor is going to do an inspection. They're going to do a annual test of the system, and so those records, well, the records for the acceptance test, which is when the system is brand new, those have to be maintained for the life of the system, and they put that on the owner. So just make sure you're keeping your documentation in a safe place.
And any good fire contractor should hang on to these after a while. I know that I've sent plenty of inspection reports to more than one person more than once, but if you ever need it, we'll have it too. But the ultimate responsibility for archiving inspection reports does rest with the owner.
Here's a new section that the code's gone back and forth on this. This has to do with concealed detectors, detectors you cannot see. Generally, it's going to be your duct smoke detectors, which would be for an air handling unit, generally on the return side, or is poked into a duct that's detecting smoke at a fire smoke damper. If you can't see them, the code used to require you have a remote LED, like the size of a single gang plate, like light switch. You have an LED on it. You got to have an LED so you can identify the location. The code's getting smart and saying, well, that's not necessary if you have an addressable system where that detector has a unique address, and you can put a description. You can say it's the 3rd floor electrical room smoke detector. So if you know where it is, why do you need to have an LED to help you further define where that device is? So just something to be aware of. And it's great for everybody because it doesn't make us have that redundant LED to help find that detector.
And then I'll just give a real quick bonus tip to everyone listening. Minnesota has a kind of a unique interpretation of the fire alarm codes. In the fire alarm codes, you will see the word fire alarm detector. And Minnesota, the AHJs, the authorities having jurisdictions, or the city fire code officials, they often interpret almost uniformly a sprinkler head as a fire detector. It's not a smoke detector, but it's a fire detector. The sprinkler heads melt at a certain temperature. They vary. However, it's treated like a heat detector. That's why you don't see a lot of smoke detectors in areas where I'd like to see them, or even a lot of engineers install them. That doesn't stop you from putting a smoke detection in, or a smoke detector in a closet or MFD room, etc. That may not be required by code, but it's typically the kind of place where a fire will start. And to get notice based on smoke versus 165 degrees at the ceiling, you know, I mean, think about that if you want to throw a handful of smoke detectors in strategic locations. Fire marshals are usually happy if there's a common sense approach to going above and beyond the code. But just so you know, a fire detector can be a sprinkler head. Mark?
So here's a section, pretty self-explanatory, but just be aware that we do have to be aware of cutting out paging systems, background music, sound masking systems in the event of a fire alarm, because sometimes we have to, or we have difficulty meeting that dB level that we need to if you have loud background music or sound masking. Some sound masking systems actually have microphones to compensate for environmental noise. Environmental noise could be that fire alarm system that's just activated. Now the sound masking system is trying to compete with that and get louder. And so there's just some language here. It makes sense, but just be aware that that does exist. And it could be a big deal in an existing building to try to identify all those systems and figure out how to cut them all out so they all shut off when there's a fire alarm condition.
Okay, and then just housekeeping, we're at 12:47, so we have a few minutes left. We're going to accelerate our pace. Just so everyone knows, if you've been looking at the chats, this document, this presentation will be available to BOLU members. So if we go a little fast, bear with us. You can come back and review the text at more time at your convenience later.
So here's a section that just real quick. So this would be audible appliances in sleeping areas. This is generally speaking like your hotels, motels, and then apartments. If you have notification appliances, you have to have a low frequency sounding device in the sleeping area. That's not low volume, but low frequency is a different type of sound that's more effective in waking people up. And now the code, the previous edition of the code put a date on it and said effective January 1st, 2014. Well, in 2014 hadn't hit yet. Well, now we're past that date, so they took the date out of effectiveness, and so that kind of does affect your ability to be grandfathered in some cases. So it's definitely something to be aware of. But low frequency is what we have to do now in all sleeping areas.
And anyone listening in a hospital environment, there may also be sleeping rooms for medical staff, and a special kind of notification device needs to be installed in that room. Here's more about carbon monoxide detection. We skip it, Mark?
Yeah, this one's pretty self-explanatory. We'll skip over this one. This is a cool one because there's a new term. Many of you maybe even heard of this, and this is kind of new to me. It's occupant evacuation elevators. They've told me since kindergarten, I think, you do not use the elevator if there is a fire. You always use the stairs. Well, they're looking at the fact that the elevator might be one of your safest places in a fire. And they may have a dedicated elevator for occupants to evacuate the building. So it's kind of a new term, and I think you're going to see more and more of this. So that's really just the takeaway on this code section is that this does exist.
And it's complicated. That's a longer discussion too when they use, but there are authorized elevator means of egress to buildings, and that factors into some of the design considerations of elevators.
So here's a good section that it's good leverage for the owner for that situation where you have a building with multiple fire alarm panels. For whatever reason, it ended up that way. Maybe it used to be multiple tenants and you bought the whole building. Now you have the whole thing and it's multiple systems. The authority having jurisdiction comes in and says, hey, we can only have one point of reset for this entire building, and you've got 5 fire panels. Well, this is leverage that actually says it's okay to be able to reset those. Yes, it's a pain to reset these individually and in the right sequence so you don't have a cyclical alarm that trips the other panels again. But the code does protect us and say, yes, it is okay to have multiple points of reset. So that's just the takeaway from this section here.
And my advice to anyone who's managed a building, try to have one fire alarm system in one address. There's certainly code provisions that allow other applications. A lot of times you'll see this in a single level situation where you have like a medical clinic next to a bunch of big box retail stores, right? So that's sometimes where you'll see a separate panel in kind of one structure.
So this section is in regards to carbon monoxide. Again, if we have carbon monoxide detectors in our building, we have to send a carbon monoxide signal to our central station. Just be careful. Some older fire panels don't have the ability to do this. So you might end up in a sticky situation sometimes where you have an ancient panel that can't send that carbon monoxide signal. So just something to be aware of.
And all modern systems that are addressable, intelligible should be able to differentiate that signal via zone to the central station.
So we talked about duct smoke detectors here a couple slides ago. And this is in regards to trying to reset those duct smoke detectors, which generally is like a switch. You have to remove power. And this is not my pitch, but it's definitely a good idea to have system duct smoke detectors, because you hit the reset button on your fire alarm panel, it takes care of all that. If you have factory installed duct smokes or mechanical puts duct smokes in, and those need to be reset, how do you do that if you don't have a central point where you can actually break power to those detectors? So, and the code is saying you do need to have a reset switch. So that can be a real pain if you have a bunch of factory installed duct detectors. So just something to be aware of there as well.
Yeah, and for all of those listening that do have factory installed duct detectors that are not tied to your fire alarm system, there's some aspects of the code that allow that. That's always something you might want to put on a capital request at some point. I won't go into the reasons, but it's always good to have, in my opinion, a duct smoke detection tied to the fire alarm system as opposed to standing alone. They often end up abandoned and people just don't look at them, and they're hard to get to. So mass notifications.
Yeah, the next few slides, I think we're probably going to skip over. I mean, this is really the point here is that there's mass notification, which is not just a fire alarm message, but you could have severe weather warning. You could have active shooter, bomb scare, whatever. I mean, there's all kinds of weird stuff happening this day and age. And so that would be mass notification. And namely, the code is acknowledging that you should do a risk analysis of your facility if you were to have a mass notification system. So I think we'll skip over a lot of these next slides because it all relates to that. And then we get into in chapter 24 of NFP 72, there's a lot of changes, and that's for emergency communication systems. The ones that we're probably most familiar with would be like a hands-free push button two-way phone in the elevator lobby or in the stairwell or in the parking ramp. And those are emergency communication systems, and they come in different shapes and forms. But there are some requirements that address that, when previously there wasn't much in the code that really said much about emergency communication systems. Now we do have some requirements that we have to adhere to, so we got to be careful that we're being code compliant in that respect.
And we are seeing, as designers, more and more applications for emergency communication by the fire alarm system. We do gas detection in medical device manufacturing or defense manufacturing, where gases can become toxic or explosives. So chemical leaks, violent intruders, all kinds of non-emergency communications can be delivered through a fire alarm system. The nice thing about a fire alarm system, as opposed to a PA system, is that the fire alarm system is supervised, so that if a wire gets cut, it monitors the integrity of the communication infrastructure. So you'll get a trouble at the panel and you'll know right away that, hey, somebody just took out this room or that wing. So we are seeing a lot more attention paid to fire alarm systems that do more than just evacuate occupants during a fire alarm condition. And that's a lot of the benefits for voice going into schools too, because we're seeing a lot more creative use to address emergencies that are non-fire alarm.
Very good. This is the last code section for us to talk about, and this one has a huge impact on owners. And this is in regards to how we send our signals to our central station. Traditionally, it's been 2 phone lines. The code's getting caught up with technology. It never catches up because technology is always, far above the code cycle, so it never gets there. But the code does acknowledge that there are issues with phone lines and it's older technology. And the code actually says you cannot use 2 phone lines anymore. Now, there are exceptions to that. The AHJ might give you an exception to that. But just be aware, having 2 phone lines going forward is not a code compliant thing. You can have 1 phone line and then something else, but you can't have the 2 phone lines. I know Brian has some comments on this too.
Yeah, so for new again, this is for new buildings, right? So, but I just think, I think phone lines, POTS, plain old telephone, I think it's really finally in Minnesota becoming a thing of the past. We have fire alarm systems that can be monitored over internet if it has the appropriate power and the city allows it. There's cellular communications for the fire alarm system. You can use a mesh radio network. But for new fire alarm systems, I don't even take fire alarm or phone lines into consideration for fire alarm monitoring. It's either IP, cell, or radio. And if you're having issues with phone lines too, you can always contact your fire alarm dealer, and they should be able to put a cell phone or radio communicator or IP in there. But there's more to it than that. But basically, I think we're turning the page on plain old telephones. And I think this is more information on that, right, Mark?
Correct. Yep. And so this last thing here is not a code change, but it's just something to be aware of. It's in the legislature right now. You probably see it on the news. I don't know anything more really than what you see in front of you. And it's regards to retrofitting existing high rises with sprinklers, because there was an unfortunate situation back in 2019. It was the day before Thanksgiving or on Thanksgiving, where some people died in the high rise. And so unfortunately, sometimes it takes that sort of event for them to make significant changes to the code. So a retroactive requirement is what the state is looking at right now. And if they do approve it, that means there's no grandfathering. If you have a high rise, they're going to give you a certain date in which you would have to have a sprinkler system by that date. I think they've identified like 69 high rises in Minnesota that are not sprinkled. So if any of you have a high rise that's not sprinkled, this definitely would have an impact on you. So I guess stay tuned to what they say on the news.
So Mark and I thank you. Like I said, you will be able to get our contact information there. LBC is happy to act as a resource. I'm going to stop sharing screen, right? So Mark and I thank everyone for their time. We've got just a couple more minutes to, Damon, do you want to close us out?
Yeah, sure. See if there's any questions. I haven't seen anything come into Q&A or chat. I do have a question though. I know that the presentation is being recorded, but is your PowerPoint, because there's a lot of stuff on there, which would be really valuable that we don't have time to go through. Is that available?
Yeah, we will make that available to you folks, so you can disseminate that to your members at your convenience. We'll send you a PDF. So what you saw on the screen, us whizzing by, you'll get a chance to read that at your convenience.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a great topic. This was with the ever-changing fire codes. This is an excellent update. So thank you very much for that.
Welcome.
So, and thank you everybody for attending. We'll keep you updated on the next month's topic. So if there's no other questions, doesn't look like it, I think we can end it here. Thanks again, guys. I appreciate it.
Good day, everyone.